welcome to episode 3 of All About That Reef.
Today we'll be focusing on mangrove ecosystems in Sri Lanka, and we have a really intellectual guest joining us later. But before we get to that, we thought we'd just give you a little bit of context so that you can follow along with us on this conversation. So to start off, Aindri, can you tell us what you know about mangroves?
Okay, so as in layman terms, I would say the first experience I ever had of mangroves was when I went on this Madoldua boat safari along the Koggala Lake, and that was my first experience of seeing mangrove forests. And then you know how they give you make you touch saltwater crocodiles and
hold the baby crocodile in your hand.
And yeah, that's my first experience of mangroves. But obviously you know it in a more technical aspect, and because you studied it and you know the science behind it. So I think you should tell everyone a bit about your experience as well.
Yeah, I think that experience is pretty universal of people going towards on those Madoldua safaris. It's honestly one of my first experiences with mangroves as well. And actually, when I started studying mangroves, it's the only reference I had to what a mangrove actually was. But then, as I've mentioned before, I started studying mangroves, and I was mind blown by actually how cool these ecosystems were. So it's a little bit tricky to define what a mangrove is, but basically, if we're to put it really simply, mangroves are basically trees that grow along the intertidal zone. So they grow at the interface of land and sea, which means that they are regularly covered by water, and they experience as the tide comes in and as the waves come in, they get covered by water, and as the tides and the waves move out, they are exposed to air. So they're these trees, these ecosystems that are exposed to a lot of variable environmental conditions. So they have developed a bunch of adaptations that help them survive it, and those adaptations, I think, are what make them so cool. So some of the first things that I can think of is they have some things called pneumatophores, which are upward growing roots that help them be able to breathe, because the soil that they grow in is usually very waterlogged and very oxygen depleted. Another thing that they have is they have salt glands on their leaves, which help them expel salt, because since they grow in these saline waters, they absorb a lot of salt when they absorb water. And then they have really thick roots called prop roots, which help them to stabilize against the incoming waves and tides. They also have they're known as vivipares, which means that they sort of grow attached to the tree. It's a little bit too difficult to explain for me, so I won't get too technical, but they're really cool, and they're not only for adaptations that you see at a very upper from a very physically observable level, but I had the incredible opportunity that when I was doing my research, I actually would sort of take leaves from different mangrove plants in Sri Lanka. I looked at a specific species called Avicennia marina, and what I did is I dissected these leaves and looked at them at a very micro level, and I was amazed by how beautiful they were even at that level. So I looked at them under scanning electron microscope, and I could see the salt glands, and I could see the cuticles, and there were they showed different thicknesses based on whether they came from areas that were more dry or whether they came from areas that were more wet. They showed differences in leaf sizes. So it was really just very fascinating to me, just thinking about how they have developed these mechanisms to essentially be able to survive.
And when you were mentioning about all of this, all I was thinking about was, how we want to protect these particular ecosystems, and we think of them as separate silos, and how we try to protect coral reefs separately to mangroves and to seagrass. But they're all interconnected, and they all have a ripple effect. For example, if we destroy the mangroves, it is only going to affect coral reefs in the end. Tell us a bit about how that works.
I think that's a really important point, because like you said, when we think about ecosystems, when we think about nature, we really think about them in like little pockets. But what we need to realize is that we live in a very interconnected system, right? And mangroves, while they have all these adaptations, they're also really cool because of all the different ecosystem services they provide. So one thing off the top of my mind is that they play a really important role as a nursery for juvenile fish. So what that means is when you lose mangrove ecosystems, you lose areas where these fish sort of spend their early years and they breed, which means then there are less fish going back into the coral reefs that are by the offshore. So that has an impact on that way. When you lose mangrove ecosystems, you lose the protection that you get from the storm surges, because they have these roots, these upward roots, the prop roots. They basically sort of stop the force of the water that comes in, and that protects entire coastlines, which means it protects livelihoods.
And if I'm not mistaken, I think that was one particular reason for us to not get that. I mean, obviously Sri Lanka was very much affected by the tsunami, but where there were mangroves, if I'm not mistaken, there
was less destruction. So
it's like a barrier for
because it essentially is a physical barrier, and it stops coastal erosion. It stops the effects of like storms. So I think what you're referring to is there was a study that was done just following the 2004 tsunami, where they noticed that villages that had mangrove forests that were intact were less affected by the tsunami and the wave action of the tsunami compared to villages that didn't have that natural defense anymore. And subsequent to that, Sri Lanka sort of began to realize how important these ecosystems were, and actually became the first country in the world to legally protect all of its mangroves.
Wow.
So they really do provide a lot. And I think when you think about mangroves in Sri Lanka, is realizing that because we live in an island and we have a lot of our population is along the coast, and a lot of these people, their livelihoods depend on mangroves, whether they realize it or not. Like if they do lagoon fisheries, then the mangroves are responsible for their shrimp harvest, their crab harvest, the sort of different like small mollusks. But even if they do coastal fisheries, like I said, because they're nursing grounds, it also means that it affects their fish catch in the ocean. Because it protects them from coastal erosion, it also means that they have some resilience to things like floods and storms, and sort of stops infrastructure being destroyed. And they're just really
so
like
cool.
it helps with tourism if you think about it, because like you said, you went on the Madol, do a safari, so those are different options where they can use the ecosystem. They also use it very frequently for medicine, for timber. There are like a lot of different uses, both direct and indirect, that the mangroves provide to us.
Actually, when you mentioned this part of like how it could be used, there are other uses of like mangroves, is when I was doing my research on seaweed. One of my friends, one of the professors were mentioning how someone should do research on mangroves, and how we can make medicinal tea out of the leaves of mangroves. And she actually did that research, and she actually came up with like a particular medicinal tea that you could actually like
That's really
put into
cool.
the market.
I'm not very proficient with the sort of different medicinal uses of mangroves, but also just recognizing that,
or maybe it was a herbal tea, but
but just recognizing that Sri Lanka has had mangroves over the last so many years, and our communities have been interacting with these, and they have so much like traditional knowledge when it comes to these ecosystems, and they use it for so many different things that Western science hasn't even gotten to. So like I was also like, so the kirala, which is a type of mangrove, like I think it's called mangrove apple in Sri Lanka. It's like a very popular fruit that they use in like juices and they consume. But it's not something that we come across really when you're doing a lot of research. So there is so much traditional knowledge as well that we really could tap into when we think about mangroves, because we don't even know how many other uses there could be.
On to asking you about how how we think rainforests are the lungs of the planet. you obviously have a different perspective on that, and I do as well, because we believe that carbon sinks. I mean, mangroves are one of the biggest carbon sinks on our on our planet. How does that work, and how is it that they have this particular feature or adaptation?
Yeah, I think mangroves as carbon sinks, less of like a perspective or like an opinion, but more of just like scientific fact now. I think when I was growing up, like you said, or like I guess when you were growing up not so long ago even, that we were always like in school, we were always taught the importance of like rainforests and like terrestrial forests.
Yeah.
But you come to realize that coastal ecosystems like mangroves, but also salt marshes and sea grasses, they actually absorb a lot more carbon, and it has to do with the fact that they are sequentially like underwater, and they have these roots that tend to usually trap a lot of organic matter. So like leaves and debris and everything collects in it, and then it gets stuck over there, and then it starts sort of getting absorbed. So instead of getting decomposed and letting that carbon dioxide out, it sort of traps it in within the ecosystem as well. But there is a flip side to that, which means that while it's a carbon sink on a normal day, when you deforest it, you're actually releasing all of that carbon back into the atmosphere. So it goes from a sink to a carbon source really, really fast. And to me, just thinking about mangroves and just even blue carbon ecosystems is sort of realizing that this is just like sort of like one aspect of like all of the different benefits that they provide. So in this world, like where we are thinking about climate change, while it is super important, there are like other aspects also that we should keep in mind. And one of that, like not only thinking in lines of climate change adaptation, but also thinking in lines of climate change resilience, right?
Yeah, for sure. And also coming to the subject about blue carbon and carbon financing, how does that work? And maybe we could ask Professor Sevvandi this as well.
Yeah.
But maybe you could touch on this so that the audience understands from like a layman's perspective.
So the gist of it is that, so thinking, even like I said, even though Sri Lanka is the first like legally protect all of its mangroves, it's not something that necessarily happens on the ground. So on the ground, mangroves and other ecosystems do face a lot of threats. So some of the threats that happen in Sri Lanka are usually development related. So one good example is shrimp aquaculture farming, and we can think of Vidatalthivu Nature Reserve as a good example. So just to give some context, Vidatalthivu Nature Reserve is Sri Lanka's third largest marine protected area, and it's also the only place in Sri Lanka where you have all three blue carbon ecosystems, which means it has sea grasses, it has salt marshes, and it has mangroves. And it's also the only place in Sri Lanka where the mangroves are directly facing the open sea. Most of our other mangroves are like sort of brackish water lagoon mangroves. And so when they face these threats, what you can do is you can sort of, there's this concept of additionality where you protect these mangroves and you show that because you have protected or conserved these mangroves or blue carbon ecosystems, there has been an additional amount of carbon that has been sequestered, that has been absorbed through your intervention. And then you quantify that carbon. So you say, because I protected 10 hectares of mangrove forest, I have absorbed 100 tons of carbon into the environment. And what you do is you sell those 100 tons of carbon at a carbon market. So this is basically, there are two types. There's the voluntary carbon market where sort of different companies and organizations voluntarily purchase carbon credits so that it's better for that, their sustainability profiles, and they can meet their different goals. And then there's the carbon market that's regulated under the Paris 6 agreement, where countries have made certain targets, like nationally determined contributions, to reduce their emissions by a certain amount, and then they purchase these carbon credits to be able to help them reach those targets. So basically, why this is important is that it provides an alternative avenue of income generation for communities for conservation. So instead of cutting down the mangrove forest so that you can build a shrimp farm, which can then contribute to the economy. What you can do is you continue to protect these areas, and you trade carbon credits that are generated from this, and use that to sort of build the community, to go into conservation, and use that to sort of generate the economy. Obviously, speaking of that, it can get really messy. This is very technical, so there's a lot of things that need to be taken into consideration when you're doing it. And what you need to do is make sure that you're doing it properly, you're doing it in line with like the legislation, you're doing it in line with the carbon standard verifications, which is like an international body that prescribes a set of like conditions that need to be met, and some of them are free, prior, informed consent of communities that are involved. So there are a lot of like technical details that are associated with it, and when you're doing sort of carbon development projects like this, you need to make sure that you're in line with those, so that you're not actually worsening the problem or disproportionately affecting communities by doing it wrong, if that makes sense. That was a lot. So
no, I think I really understood what you meant, and like it was really interesting because you explained it so well, even for someone who didn't understand all of that. who doesn't understand this whole like blue carbon and carbon financing and things like that. So yeah, thank you for that explanation. But you also mentioned Viduthalthivu and how it's one of the largest marine protected areas in Sri Lanka, and there was a huge issue about it, and I think something that I'm really grateful for was how the community got involved. And I mean, we always talk about how people could get involved and support these kind of issues in Sri Lanka, but I think this was one topic that everyone actually, like even if it was just sharing a post, everyone got involved in like creating this huge, like I mean it's a positive.
It's a win, I would say.
Yeah.
It's actually really funny that you bring that up, because one of the ways I got involved in the organization LEF that I was working in right now is that the first time when Viduthalthivu was sort of under threat for shrimp aquaculture farming, which I believe was in 2020 during COVID. Actually, like the only reason I knew LEF existed was because I saw these posts as part of their social media campaign that were going around. So it was really cool to see how much reach it had. And so in 2020 it was under threat for shrimp aquaculture farming, and then sort of because there were so many like protests and things like that, it didn't pass. It continued to stay protected, like its legal protection wasn't removed. But just last year again there was an attempt when a gazette was passed by the ministry to de-gazette 169 hectares of the marine protected area, and while they didn't give an exact reason, it was assumed once again to be for shrimp aquaculture farming, and once again there was a lot of media attention that was brought to it, but also different NGOs, I think Environmental Foundation and WNPS, if I remember correctly, and a few others if I'm not wrong, filed court cases against the decision, and the Supreme Court placed an interim order to sort of halt this decision, which means that it continues to be protected right now, which is really cool because it shows that why legal frameworks matter, and like how they can be used as a tool to ensure continued protection of these ecosystems. So while like sometimes the legal tools are there and like it's not followed and enforcement on the ground is bad, there are also those times when it does work in our favor, and those wins I think are always to be celebrated.
Definitely. But yeah, I think this is a really interesting conversation as well when it comes to like how mangroves matter. I think this gives like a very quick one-on-one mangroves one-on-one. I think Aindri, something that you mentioned to me earlier was that mangroves are like a lifestyle, not a tree, and that's like a really important point that I sort of like it stuck with me, and just to sort of like sum it up, it's really cool also when you think about it, because like sharks or like mammals like whales, just because they come under like are called whales, it usually means that they're under one taxonomic group, which means that they're related to each other, and that's why they share some similar features.
But when you think about mangroves, it's not necessary that they fall under the same taxonomic group or that they're related to each other, but they have sort of evolved into these particular species and show these like adaptations and perform these ecosystem services as a survival mechanism. And I think that's like a really sort of cool note, and also just something for us to think about as well.
So basically, every mangrove is not necessarily related to each other.
Yeah. So there are like, you could have like species of mangroves that are have connections, like Avicennia marina and Avicennia officinalis are obviously species from the same family, but then doesn't mean that they belong to one large taxonomic group as such.
Interesting.
Yeah.
And I think we could wrap up our conversation and introduce our professor that will be joining us. Shout out to Pass It On for sponsoring this episode.
And now we're back. Today we have joining with us a really interesting guest. Her name is Professor Sevvandi Jayakody, and she's an expert on mangroves. So I think we can get started with asking some questions.
Yes.
Yeah.
So Professor Sevvandi, thank you so much for accepting this invitation, and we are so happy to have you here. Just tell us a bit about how you got into wetland conservation and mangroves as a whole.
I think it all goes back to the time that I was a tomboy, always wanting to be out and about, and then finding when you go into your advanced level studies that there is something called biology. I fell in love with biology, and that's exactly the reason why I really wanted to do a basic degree also in biology. And that's basically it. But then biology being a very vast area, then you also have to work out within that what you really want to be and what you really want to focus on. And my focus has been sort of, I must say, from time to time shifting. That's not just because I wanted to sort of pay attention to more crucial matters. I would say the focus changed as I go forward, understanding where are the places where less is done, where you need more attention, more research, where you need more evidence. So for me, doing a PhD on red deer in mountains, I was assuming that I would come back and I would spend my times off in Horton Plains and chasing deer. But then coming back, being in uni, understanding that marine and coastal areas have been very least investigated, and that's where most of the crucial problems are. And that's exactly how I started focusing more on coastal things. And from basic science, I am now in a phase where I'm moving more into governance and policy. So that's basically I am.
And how do you feel about moving from moving into governance and policy?
Well, it's two things, you see, because to go into governance, you really can't do it without the science. So I'm still so much into what I would say the primary sciences. Perhaps I'm not the person that is in the field collecting the data, but now I have developed a lot of youngsters that have gone into that. So there's several MPhil students, PhD students, and also very importantly research groups that are working on these things. So they bring the evidence for me to think what's the right governance. So you simply can't segregate it. Your governance and policies would be really useless if you really don't fit in with the current science. So I'm in both the areas, but spend, I would say, a bit more time trying to look at how I decipher the science into governance.
I think you bring up like a really interesting point that we see again and again on like the importance of like science data driven and like how these should be what sort of navigate how we want to influence our legal frameworks, our policy systems, our sort of goals and targets, like even with the NDCs and things like that, right? Can you tell us a little bit more on maybe just to backtrack a little bit on like for our listeners who probably are not very proficient in what mangroves are, or what wetland ecosystems are, and like why they're important. Could you maybe just give us a little bit of context on that matter?
Surely, yes, because the very first thing that I always hear when I talk about wetlands, everyone expects that a wetland should have water throughout the year and that it should be a place with water. So we have to backtrack a bit and see what exactly is the definition of a wetland. And for that, the best place that we can park ourselves is Ramsar Convention and the definition given by the Ramsar Convention. And two words matter here. They say permanent or temporary. So that word temporary matters a lot to me with the type of ecosystems that I work, because most coastal ecosystems which are wetlands really don't have water some time of the year, like salt marshes can be bone dry, but they are a wetland. Then some of the man-made wetlands like rice paddies, paddy fields are also a type of wetland, and then we have to then work out exactly what is a wetland. So wetlands can have both permanent water and temporary water. They can be coastal, brackish or marine, but when it comes to marine, there is also a border. We are talking about coastal areas that are up to the depth of 6 meters. So that, I would say, is basically what a wetland is, Mehak. And then coming to your second question, among the wetlands you wanted me to focus a bit on mangroves. Okay, so mangroves are another very important wetland, mainly because they kind of mark the end of one end of flowering plants moving from the terrestrial areas into the coastline. Because after mangroves and the sea grasses, the sea and the coastal area do have plants, but none of them are flowering plants. So mangroves are essentially a group of plants and the ecosystem that it creates. Because the word mangroves is always used sometimes to describe just one plant, sometimes a community of plants, but also the ecosystem. So I'm here focusing on the ecosystem as mangroves. So basically what is mangroves is a group of very specialized plants that have the anatomical adaptation. So they have very specific characters that enable them to be in tidal areas where there's a lot of sediments, muddy, boggy, less oxygen, anaerobic conditions, and also you are talking about species that tend to create this environment, and where some very specialized animals would inhabit both permanently as well as periodically, seasonally, in order to come and utilize these plants, and not just the plants but also the sediments and so on and so forth. So mangroves are highly specialized plants, and that's why we talk about them as true mangroves, because you don't find them elsewhere. They are confined to areas where you have these kind of very specific brackish water conditions.
Yeah, I think also I really relate a lot to what you said, because as you know, Prof, I actually did some of my research under you, and when I started doing my research, I didn't really know anything about mangroves. Like I just
did a lot.
I just did it actually because I've heard that we have mangroves in Sri Lanka, and then as I continued to study them and started doing literature reviewing, just understanding all of the different adaptations they had, like physical adaptations, and like how incredible they were, and their ability to survive some extremely harsh conditions, and how they're even found, you know, because I did my research initially in Abu Dhabi, which is some of the hottest seas in the world, and to see that they could survive in temperatures that were 10 degrees hotter than today's seas. So they're actually so important when you think about a future climate change affected world as well, right? And I think also not only its physical adaptations, but coastal ecosystems in generally, their carbon sequestration potential, right? Like they're known to be blue carbon ecosystems because they can absorb so much carbon from the atmosphere, and that's so relevant today just given that, with climate change upcoming, with how we want to meet all of our different goals for each country, but also thinking in terms of climate change resilience, right? And sort of the importance that these important roles that these ecosystems play in this regard. Could you just touch on that a little bit as well and talk about those aspects of these ecosystems?
Yeah. So I would say, Aindri Morahela, the interest of mangroves in recent years is mainly because the world has identified that these ecosystems have the potential to sequester carbon, fix carbon, and also keep the carbon storages as it is for a long time. Because of that, we also see that they can be used and they should be used for other purposes. One such purpose is to understand how can these ecosystems be used from one side to ensure the carbon that's already there are kept as it is so that they are not released. Because one thing very few people understand is that just like the ability for them to sequester carbon and store them, if you disturb them, they also have the ability to release it. So we have a moral obligation to protect them, because knowing that amongst different culprits for global climate change, carbon dioxide is one, or rather the most important and the major one. And the moment we destroy mangroves, we are talking about potentially high levels of carbon being released back to the ecosystem. And then you also have the other thing. What are the benefits a country could take by committing to these ecosystems? So because when you save and safeguard or restore mangroves in one country, you are not just benefiting to the community there, you are doing something globally important. Therefore, then you can, in this current era, work out, you have the so-called polluters, and then you also have the countries, the communities that could all do exactly the reverse of it. And then how do you benefit? How do you ensure that those who are committing to safeguard are recognized and that the due benefits of those things are given back to them? And that's where the carbon finances come in. Again, but coming to that, I always say that's something that have to be managed properly, because you are talking about a voluntary market and an involuntary market, and also half the time, not just in Sri Lanka but all over the world, most natural ecosystems are state owned, so they are not the land of the communities, but then communities have been living in these ecosystems, either fishing or any other activity, for a long time. So that when you start looking at mangroves in the eye of global climate change and also as a solution, you have to do it very carefully. You have to make sure that everyone are included and no one is left behind. But very importantly, Morahela, you have to also understand carbon is just one thing of many ecosystem services. So something that was muddy and boggy, which we really discarded and didn't pay attention, is now taking all the attention because of carbon. What do we know tomorrow? What new thing will be highlighted, and accordingly from what angle would we be looking at? So therefore, only thinking about carbon and looking at mangroves may not be a very wise thing. So that's how I look at it.
Quite interesting. I just also want to let the audience know about the restoration efforts that you have done at Annavidundava and lots of marine protected areas. Tell us a bit about how the restoration process works and roughly how long it would take to restore an area that has been destroyed.
Okay. So the very first thing, Aindri, is to understand the meaning of the word restoration. Half the time I spend a lot of time thinking, what am I doing? What am I really restoring? Because we are used to planting and seeing a tree grow. But then my question for me is am I doing restoration? Is a tree happily growing in an area? Is that restoration? So start with that. So over the years, what I've understood is restoration is not that. Restoration is first understanding what is this ecosystem doing in a given area, what type of environmental services has it been providing, but most importantly understanding that I'm getting a glimpse of a time, and in that during that particular time period I might see a next number of animals and plants. But is that really the ecosystem? Now that's very, very valid when we start talking about degraded places where we go for restoration. So we have to always bear in mind, I'm trying to go back and try and create something, perhaps what was given as the by default, the proper ecosystem. Yet I have to always keep in my mind what is default may or may come, may or may not come just because we restore. However, our target should be identify a system, understand what stresses have brought the ecosystem to a certain level where we ourselves say, oh, it's not what it should be, right? And once we know it, then the next important thing is working out what you really want it to be, okay? And that's where we cannot be nostalgic. Because anyway, ecosystems are very dynamic things. So the whole thing is restoration is try and give it a rest from the disturbances it's been going through and see whether the ecosystem could heal by itself, because that's what the model we use at Aanavillundava, assisted or accelerated natural regeneration, where we try to first remove the barriers, the disturbances, and see can the nature reclaim. But when the nature reclaims, what is in the periphery matters a lot. So I might select an area and I might start restoring, but what nature brings back is another set of invasives. You are not into restoration. So that's where we have to work out right, but maybe not this species. Even if it comes, we have to remove it. These are the required species and their relationships, and then basically studying how the plants would go. So from place to place, Aindri, the number of months, number of years it would take will differ. And no one can say, I've now fully restored, basically, because system will always move from one to the other. But a very good indicator would be if you have the wisdom of the people that had been living there before, the day when they say, okay, these are the species that we harvested, we used, and now they are back. At least then you know you've gone several generations back. But that's what they have seen. We don't know what was this ecosystem a generation before that. That's why I said we cannot be nostalgic.
I think you tapped on a lot of different concepts, and some of them were a bit technical and specific. So just so that our listeners are also able to follow the conversation, I just want to provide them some context. So Professor Sevvandi was talking about Aanavillundava, which is, if I'm not wrong, one of Sri Lanka's 6 Ramsar wetland sites. And in the 1980s, a large portion of it was degraded due to shrimp aquaculture farming. And I think in the last few years, the DWC, along with a few NGOs such as the Wildlife and Nature Protection Society, have worked on doing some assisted natural regeneration of the mangroves in the area, which has involved, as Professor Sevvandi meant, trying to restore the ecosystem services. And what they have done, if I'm not wrong, is work very closely with the community, incorporated aspects of traditional knowledge, but also combined scientific data to figure out what is the best process to restore these ecosystems.
That's exactly. So the restoration model has 3 key elements. One, making sure that we have partners that are willing to come forward. So government sector, wildlife conservation department, then academia, Wambi University, then we have the non-governmental agencies, as you mentioned, Wildlife and Nature Protection Society as the science leader, Biodiversity Sri Lanka, and then private sector. Everyone put in some contribution. So that's one side. The second side of the restoration is ensuring that we have rigorous data collection so that it is science backed, so that every decision we take, the impact of decision is understood so that we can change our management decisions. Third element of this is making sure that the communities feel the restoration and they understand it's a part of them, and that they are also directly and indirectly benefited and they understand it. Because most of the time indirect benefits are very hard to say. A fisherman will be happy if he sees fish, but he will not know how much carbon is stored and what's the benefit of it for generations to come. And that's where the awareness comes in. So we also spend a lot of time making sure that those who come gets the idea about restoration, our model, the science that goes in, and making sure they go back empowered, understanding that restoration should be science driven, should be done with the community, and partnerships matter.
Could you talk to us a little bit about the scientific restoration methods you all use? Because I do also understand you all tried like the fishbone method, then that wasn't so ideal, so then you all modified that and made up like your own system. Just a little bit on that as well.
So now this method is specific to Anuvilundava, and it can be applied to any place where you have the natural water flow is blocked, either by fish ponds or dikes or whatever. So the method is simply looking at the contour of the area so that you understand if you are going to break the dikes of shrimp ponds, in which manner you could bring the water. So to start with, Mehak, we didn't have that data, we didn't have that wisdom also. So we basically went and came up with what I would call the straight palmate style. So it's very much like a palm front. But with time we understood it's very mechanical and very rigid. Whereas if we follow the contours of the ecosystem, then you are really facilitating the water to flow and to be in the right place. So that from the rigid straight palmate style, now we have gone into what we call the contoured palmate style. So that the benefit of that is with the rain and with the high tide, the water comes and it easily follows the contours. But in certain other places, we don't adopt any of these techniques. Simply what we do is, we would open up an area and ensure the natural tide comes and goes. So that's the style that we use. Once we do these kind of interventions, the next thing that we do is we leave the system to acclimatize, because the sediments got to come, the water got to sort of go back to the right sort of conditions, because now mangroves, as I said, are brackish water plants, so they need a certain salinity, they need a certain pH, and they obviously definitely need certain amount of sediment. So we acclimatize, or rather leave it aside without doing anything, and then we start seeing the signs of little seedlings coming by themselves. That's the point, or rather the indicator that's telling us, okay, time for planting. So then we have the nurseries in the system itself, rather than bringing the plants from elsewhere. Mehak, more than anyone, you know why it's important, because genetic identity of plants got to be taken care of. So something that grows in the wet zone, you don't want to take it to dry zone and plant it. That's why we source the plants from the same area. And then we go ahead and plant only the required number to stabilize the banks of the canals that we cut, and then let the nature to bring the rest of the seeds. So it's simple work.
She's saying it's simple work as if
It's a simple work. I think from my understanding, actually restoration is very time intensive, very costly, very high effort. So I think that's just again like a testament. So while the theory in principle is rather simple, the amount of investment, both in terms of time and effort and money and knowledge and everything really is so high, right? So I think this leads us really nicely to the point that, you know, conservation is always better than restoration, that at this point we should try to conserve as opposed to try anything else. So is there maybe something you can share with our listeners on what they can do and how they can get involved in wetland conservation?
I think you too touched the most important thing. I said simple, the theory, I totally agree with it. However, to do that, if you look at Tanuvulundav itself, you will see the amount of millions we've spent in order to come up with the canals, and the fact that it's so important that we have 24/7 scientific staff. So that's all money. But the most interesting thing is, by spending that much of money and a lot of effort, how much have we conserved? Maybe 10-20 hectares maximum for the time being. If you take the entire country, our investments and the restoration is less than 500 hectares at the moment. So restoration always, in my opinion, is in piecemeal, smaller areas where you have to put a lot of effort. But these little pieces will be like a part of a jigsaw where you really need to have them so that you connect the bigger, more important natural ecosystems. So conservation first, Meha. Without conservation, what is existing, restoration can never fill the gap of conservation. So for me, we have to put our mind, heart and effort to restore conserve what is available. We should not touch any of, not just the mangroves, any coastal ecosystem that is extensive, continuous, because they provide the ecosystem services no restoration can bring in. So my appeal to the public, you have a voice, you hear the things, and what is so important is always make sure that you understand and that you raise your voice and also give your opinions for not just to Sri Lanka but to the entire world, why the world requires interconnected continuous ecosystems, whether it is coastal or marine or land, terrestrial, what is land, does not matter. Conservation first and conservation for everyone, because we are in a world where conservation is very anthropocentric. We do it for people, but time has come for us to think of ecocentric approach, where irrespective of the value of certain things for human beings now, we have to think of conservation. That's the way forward.
Yeah. Thank you so much for your thoughts and your experience and expertise. I think it was quite an interesting talk, and
I think we hope it at least gave a glimpse into how important these ecosystems are and like how much effort is actually going into protecting and restoring these ecosystems. So thank you so much, Professor Sevvandi, for coming here and taking time out to be with us today.
And thank you so much to you two girls. I'm really proud of you both.
Thank you. And thank you also to all of our listeners for tuning in and listening to us speak.
See you next time. This podcast is a CreatorCast production.